Good afternoon and welcome to the Alberta Land Institute Research Showcase. My name is Erins Question and I'm the Research Director for ALI. With me today is ALI Director Dave Poulton and the ALI team, including Hannah and Kevin, who will help me to moderate the discussion. If this is your first ALI event, we are an independent research institute based at the University of Alberta, and we are committed to promoting, advancing research in the service of better land use and land management in the province and beyond. Please visit our website to learn more about our work. We are broadcasting to you today from Treaty 6 territory. The University of Alberta respects the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First People of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. Our purpose today is to showcase 3 recent cutting-edge projects conducted by 3 of our excellent research partners and their teams. We are very proud to have supported this work. And finally, Dr. Brent Swallow, professor in the Department of Resource Economics and Environmental Sociology at ALI's home faculty, the Faculty of Agricultural Life and Environmental Sciences. And he will present his findings and analysis of trends, drivers, and attitudes toward farmland fragmentation, conversion, and preservation in Alberta.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for inviting this work to be presented today. I'm particularly glad to have a few people like Sherry Young on this call. Her ears may burn when she sees some of the slides about Okotoks, but I'm also glad that she set this up a little bit by asking questions about valuation of the ecosystem services of land. So we do some work on that I'll present today. This is a pretty big group. We've been at this for some time. Scott Jeffrey, who's also on the line, was involved in the first phase of this work. I've worked closely with my colleague Feng Chu throughout maybe the last 5 or 6 years of work on this, plus Robert Summers, and then a number of graduate students who've completed master's thesis work. And Hotaka Kabori, the last student there, is also on the call, and he's the one who's working away right now on this. So he's eager to hear your comments. And we thank the Land Institute, the Max Bell Foundation, the Alberta Real Estate Foundation for financial support for this work, as well as Real Property Solutions for help with the data that we use. So I'm going to cover quite a span of work to show you kind of what we know, and then with a bit more attention on recent findings. Motivated all the work on agricultural land conversion and fragmentation because of the importance of agricultural land, both for producing food and other agricultural products, but also amenity values. And there's a variety of those that are important, ranging from kind of rural character that we think is important in Alberta to things like wildlife habitat and a whole range of ecosystem services. And those ecosystem services, which are often not reflected in market values, will generally be lost over time if we don't have policy constraints. So without policy constraint, we'll have growth that causes conversion and fragmentation of both natural and agricultural land, both of which produce important ecosystem services, and also will lead to diffuse urban services, which are hard for municipalities to service. Most jurisdictions in the advanced world have some type of policy constraint on conversion and fragmentation. I have numbers here from the United States, land in land trusts and the Conservation Reserve, large programs that affect large areas in Ontario and British Columbia, relatively weak here in Alberta, many policy documents sort of expressing the need to conserve farmland, especially prime farmland, with most of that responsibility devolved to decisions by municipalities and region boards in the case of the Edmonton and Calgary region area. At the same time, there's increasing interest in this, that this conversation has reflected that in the effects of land use on health large new findings about the positive contributions of green space to people's health, and also nature-based responses to climate change, things like the discussion about green infrastructure. So what I'm going to take you through four studies which are complete, and one study which is we're kind of up and moving on, that Hotaka's working on. The first one, I'm just going to give you, let me just to introduce that. We've been doing this work at multiple scales. So this shows the work we've done at the scale of the white/agricultural zone, primarily private property in southern Alberta and northwest Alberta, the corridor area between the Edmonton region and the Calgary region, and the Edmonton capital region, as well as the city of Edmonton. And then most recently, we're doing some comparative work also with the mainland of British Columbia around Vancouver. We're lucky to have access to data, imagery from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, which does an annual crop inventory analysis through satellite imagery. So we've had that data for many years. We've did a set of work comparing, using that data to compare the situation the year 2000 to the situation year 2012. We also have done some updates of that. We have a huge set of data on house prices across Alberta provided by Real Property Solutions starting in 2010. And we've done analysis, and we recently have data up to March of 2021. So that's kind of fueling new set of work. Our previous findings about the conversion, how extensive is it, where is it, what are the drivers of it, is summarized here, and also in all of the papers which are listed at the bottom of this slide deck. Most of the conversion that occurs from agriculture to developed uses is in the corridor between Edmonton and Calgary and the areas around those two major metropolitan regions. Much lower outside of that corridor area. Work by Kayla Stan and Arturo Sanchez found that when they look back to the 1980s to 1990s and 1990s to 2000s, land use conversion from agriculture to developed uses was even higher than it has been in the first decade of this century. So this is a long-standing challenge that we have. Fragmentation in the most recent period from 2000 to 2012, fragmentation, that is sort of the amount of the sort of divisions on the landscape, has actually declined to the level of the white zone, but it's increased within the corridor area. So we've got this kind of two big different tails. Especially around Edmonton, we've seen that fragmentation has been a precursor to conversion. So changes in the landscape that has divided the land, say into rural residential, has often been the kind of the lead edge of conversion of that land from all the way from agriculture into developed uses. Looking at drivers of those changes, we see the population growth, proximity to the two big cities, proximity to Highway 2 are the main drivers of conversion, as well as spatial techniques help us to understand that conversion from one township has spilled over to higher conversion in neighboring townships. So we have a kind of a positive spillover effect, and therefore very important that municipalities kind of coordinate what they do. Study by Hawan Wang and Feng Chu has found that higher conversion of agriculture to developed uses around Edmonton has had a knock-on effect of decreasing deforestation in kind of concentric rings extending out of Edmonton. So you've got a localized shock, which has these kind of ripple effects standing out. We did an update recently. We had all of this work done from the 2000 to 2012 period, and we wanted to update to 2018. This shows in gold the areas that were developed as of the year 2000 for Edmonton and Edmonton metropolitan region. The green areas were then converted primarily from agriculture, but to developed in the 2012 to 2000 period. And then the red areas are the most recent 2012 to 2018 conversions. So the red areas are for kind of half as long a period as for the green areas. We've done that for the 6 major metropolitan areas or urban areas of Alberta that you can see on this map, and the same color scheme. So you can see the kind of the patterns of the development which occurred from 2000 to 2012 and then 2012 to 2018. And then actually Hannah did the little graphic on the left side there about the compound annual increase in the developed land around the 6 areas. And you can see that Edmonton was very high in the year 2000 to 2012, something like 3.5%. Edmonton's rate of conversion came down a bit in annual terms from that first period to the 2012-2018 period, at the same time as Calgary kind of reversed. So it had shows the reverse of that. The swings are a bit more pronounced in the other smaller areas. Partly that's the areas involved are much smaller, so the percentage changes tend to be bigger. So in every case, we see that there has the sizes of the kind of urban footprint, the developed footprint around these metropolitan regions has been somewhat outpacing the rate of population growth, which means that we're getting sparser populated winds rather than more densely populated, which I think is shows a big problem and challenge for planners. So that's kind of the update on the land use change analysis. Here quickly, a slide here about work that was done, more qualitative work done by Bob Summers and Darren Epperson and Natalia Osorio in 2018-19. They also interviewed a variety of stakeholders in these processes, both elected officials, planners, and others. They found elected officials many of them had the personal views that they thought the property owners should have the right to use land as they see fit, that they wanted to be fair in allowing individual landowners to register, to designate land from agriculture into other land uses. And they wanted to avoid being wrong, as they expressed it, in rejecting applications for redesignation of land. Some of them also equated long-term residency with stronger rights to develop, so that someone who had lived in the community for a long time and paid taxes, their applications should be given a more, they should be err on the side of allowing the application. Planners, somewhat different. Planners seeing development more as a privilege that landowners have rather than a right. And both planners and elected officials expressing concerns about the possibility that failing to approve redesignation will push development to more lenient neighbors, a little bit as Sherry talked about the Okotoks experience with their nearby municipality. They were concerned about weak guidance from the provincial government, and those who were trying to implement restrictions on preserving prime agricultural land expressed uncertainty about the indicators for agricultural land quality that they could use in those decisions. Here's the result for Sherry and others interested in policy. We've tried to look at kind of natural experiments where there have been policy changes to try to understand how municipalities' approach to growth or development or conservation might have effect on house prices. So Okotoks was one of the best examples we could find because they had this distinct finite growth policy from 98 to 2012, which has quite ambitious numbers in terms of maintaining green space and living within the water allocation of the Sheep River that they had and maintaining a population size that could live within that. And then since 2012, have moved to the continuous growth policy. We were interested in what could we learn from that in terms of house prices, because from RPS, we had house prices for hundreds of houses that had exchanged hands before, during the previous period and after the policy change. When we did that, you can't just do a simple comparison of means because different types of houses may have been transacted before and after. So we had to take account of that using this technique that I've described there. So we're looking at before and after, what was the value of living near pasture and cropland for people in Okotoks. And a few results. One was that certainly it changed the houses that were sold in the post period. So less exchange of houses that have nearby pastures and cropland. We found generally that people were willing to pay for proximity to both cropland and pastures, especially pasture land, but that willingness to pay decreased by about half after the policy change. And that overall, that policy change led to an overall 8.4% reduction in the value of Okotoks residential real estate. And so for an average house, I think the average was something like $520,000. You can think about the numbers involved in that. So policy matters. Trying to inform policy in other places, we're thinking about what can we learn from looking at both house prices, but also what can we learn from just talking to people. So we have two techniques in economics to get at that. One, using what we call stated preference. We did a study in 2015 of their attitudes toward conservation of agricultural land within the Edmonton metropolitan region. We surveyed 350 respondents in an online panel. We looked at their willingness to pay into a pool and make a one-time payment into a pool that would conserve farmland within the region. We then kind of amplified that study in 2018 with increasing our sample size to over 1,300 in the 6 most populous urban regions. We also georeferenced the location of everyone who responded to our survey. We looked at their attitudes toward transition from different types of agricultural land to different types of developed land. We had concern about the idea of willingness to pay into a pool. That meant that agricultural landowners might be seen as having the right to convert their land and would have to be paid to give up that right. We also thought you could flip this over and think about this as all of us have the right to land that's designated for agriculture to remain agriculture, and maybe we should be compensated if that right is given up. So we treated that as used willingness to accept compensation and compared the results of the two. We also, because we had the geolocations of everyone who answered our survey, we could actually relate their responses to how close they live to farmland. So this is what we presented people with different scenarios of different types of land use, either that would occur or that may be prohibited or would be stopped from occurring, from 3 types of agricultural land use to 3 types of non-agricultural land use, costing different amounts for willingness to pay to prevent conversion, or people being compensated different amounts for allowing conversion to proceed. This is work which is forthcoming in the journal Land Economics. We found very few people thought that we didn't have enough land conserved for development. We found a large, 41% of people thought we didn't have enough land conserved for agriculture, and 41% thought we did have enough. So there's some appetite for more conservation of agricultural land, though there's even more appetite for more conservation of natural areas around these 6 areas that we studied. Our results are that respondents prefer to keep grassland relative to cropland. They're more willing to pay for conserving grassland. They're more willing to give up that land to be converted if it's converted into light industry in the area around the city rather than residential or commercial. Roughly, we kind of can categorize people into 3 groups: strong preservers who would be willing to make sizable contributions to conserve farmland, weak preservers who would make some contribution, and developers who really wouldn't be interested in making a conservation to conserve and were essentially pro-development. The mean willingness to pay is shown here, $400 to $500 as a one-time payment. We found these 2 approaches, willingness to pay for preservation, kind of assuming farmers have the right to convert, willingness to accept compensation, assuming that the public have the right for land to be held in agriculture, essentially equally valid in all the indicators that we have. We found the proximity to farmland actually and to the University of Alberta farm reduced people's willingness to pay for farmland. So people lived in the center of the city were more willing to pay for conserving farmland around the city. So that's one way to think about valuing, sort of getting at what do people consider the public value of farmland. Another way to get at it is how much are people willing to pay in terms of an additional amount to their house to live near different types of open space. So we considered agricultural land as one type of open space that would affect housing prices around the city. And then we compared that to other types. So we use a technique called hedonic price analysis for that, which helps us understand both the value of house attributes, but also where it's located and the local environment around the house. By doing that spatially, we can also look at the spillover effects. So as my house maybe is higher valued because I live next to the ravine, that the fact that my house has a higher value because of that also influences my neighbor's house in a positive way in that case. It could be positive or negative spillovers. We used data again from RPS for this, as well as a number of other sources. So what we looked at was how close did someone live near to agriculture, which we consider to be developable, so something that could be converted in the future, compared to a form of agriculture which probably most people think as a sort of non-developable, which is the University of Alberta South Campus Farm, which is shown as in the light green in that little insert of the map. A woodland, a non-agricultural but developable use, and then various categories of park, which we assume to be non-developable, because we think that people think about both what's the current use, but what's the possibility of that use being changed, as I think the Okotoks case showed. Hotaka came up with this new variable called green coverage. We think it's also important, and you can see in the little inset there, we have a house in the middle, somewhat of Windsor Park, relatively near to the ravine. There's a park right in their neighborhood that could affect their house price, but also living near the ravine might also affect their house price. And so we measure that and contrast that to the house in Park Allen, which has the same size park nearby, but isn't within 700 meters of the river valley. This shows for those 9,500 houses, they're all there, you can count them. If they're not overlaying each other across the map of Edmonton, you can see areas that have the blue areas, dark blue areas, have very good access to green space nearby. The red areas have the least good access to open space nearby, and the other colors are intermediate. So you can see that those open space houses, high open space houses, are clustered along the North Saskatchewan River, as well as the Mill Creek Ravine and the White Mud Ravine, and then some areas to the north of the city. We also looked at, in this map, overlaid that with or looked at income. So we can see areas where there's higher income, or the blue areas which kind of ring around the city, the newer subdivisions of the city, developments of the city, and the red areas, especially north of the river in older suburbs. So if we put those two together, people who are kind of rich in open space and rich in terms of the average income of their neighborhood, it looks like this, where we have the red dots, again, areas that are relatively short on open space nearby, and then the underlying color showing areas with relatively low incomes. We can see there many areas, there's a clustering of people with relatively low income, with relatively poor access to open space, with a few exceptions. And the exception probably is most interesting is probably to the west of the city, where there's a relatively high income area with relatively poor access to open space. But overall, there's a pretty strong correlation. So we're starting to explore this data now. So in this overall analysis, then spatial Edonic analysis of house prices, we find that there are a number of factors we would expect to affect a house price. You can see in the structural attributes. The neighborhood attributes are also important. And then we look at the environmental aspects that we have special attention to in this project, where distance to agricultural development actually had a negative effect. So if it was positive effect, so the further you were away from an agricultural development area, the higher you're willing to pay for the house. So people didn't like, by this looks at it, they don't like living right next to agricultural land. However, they did like living near to the U of A farm, so a non-developable agriculture. They did like living near to non-agricultural, like woodland. They did like live nearing parks, and certainly the green coverage was a very positive, had a very positive effect on house prices. So the next steps we're doing, so this is my last slide with Hotaka's work now, is thinking about the more health benefits, especially this issue about green equity of living near open space. Once we take into account, then we're more interested in the kind of equity effects. We have data, we've all heard the stories about COVID-19 affecting park visits, and we wonder how that has affected the demand for both private open space, or people, perhaps a new demand for houses outside of a city, but also housing which is within the city, but with more open space, using these hedonic price approaches to update to the most recent period. And then with the most recent period, we can look at, as a sort of a policy shock on the system, what happened as a result of COVID-19 and the different stages of recovery from that, and how has that affected the demand that people have for these green open spaces and blue open spaces. Okay, so I'm sorry if I've run a bit over time, and I'll stop there.
First of all, thank you for that. I hadn't seen that information before about before and after our policy change. So that's really interesting. And I actually took a screenshot while we were talking and shot it over to my boss. So I'm going to have to pull that study. I was going to ask you for the study, but yeah, I'd like a copy of that just so we could talk about it, because that's another thing we're talking about with our developers, right? Because they don't want to pay for things. But if they know that the house prices are going to bring in more money, it's a really good way to get them to align with our MDP that really preserves green spaces. So thank you for that.
Yeah, sorry, just to follow up, I'd be happy to get into a more substantive session with your colleagues. We've had some discussions with some of the realtors in the area as well. So I think it'd be fun to have a broader, both your colleagues, but also perhaps another time with a kind of a bit broader community in the area to see how these resonate.
Sure.
Because it's
I was going to say that would be really great, because we're doing, I think that it reflects, it's a little bit more about the previous conversation as well, that we need to communicate risk, but also availability of undevelopable land, both to developers, and it's still about that engagement, right, with your developers and your residents. So I thought that was really neat. Yeah, I'd like to see whatever follow-up you have for 2020. Do you guys have plans to do a study that following this, like with the update with the change in COVID and the increase in amounts of dogs per household and all of that, and how that impacts green space?
Yeah. So the dog effect, I don't think we have a dog variable, but so I think that, so Hotaka actually has some data which has been looking at visitors using some of the Google applications, visitors to parks, tracking for Calgary, for Canada as a whole, Calgary, Edmonton, and Vancouver. And we see relative to that, there have been these swings in visits, so an uptake in interest in visiting parks. At the same time, and I think we might think about, does that cycle with interest in getting more acreages, or does it cycle counter to interest in getting more acreages? I don't know. It would be interesting to try to get at that question. But both of that, in all of that, the shock has been much larger in Vancouver, much more park visitation in Vancouver than in Edmonton. And why might that be? Is it because we already have backyards that we've retreated to? rather than parks. We expect to see quite large differences between Vancouver and Edmonton, and because of Brookfield giving us that access to that more lower mainland data, we can look at it for the first time. So stay tuned. Hotaka will finish his work in about 6 months or so, I would guess, and then there'll be some neat results.
That's really great. And if there's nobody else with their hand up right now, I wanted to jump into a second question. Oh, I was going to say it would be interesting to see also the comparison with like the integrated factors between and the balance between risk and reward, right? So wanting to be closer to green spaces, but understanding that if you're closer to green spaces, you're more at risk for a fire hazard, for example, or, it would be interesting. I'm pretty sure that people won't think that far ahead considering the last presentation, but it would be interesting if we could integrate those communication methods.
Yeah, we have a colleague, Vic Adamovich, who was interested in, just sort of as a partial answer to your question, interested in how Edmonton's new flood risk mapping may have affected house prices in those areas. I would guess we're not going to be able to ferret it out. The result be small enough, we're not going to be able to tease it out, frankly. We also have tried to look at, environmental risks like the former Domtar factory for railway ties in Northeast Edmonton, and then findings about some of the possible cancer risks associated with the houses on that area. And, it's on again, off again, what the finding is, but there, it may have turned people off a bit. We haven't so far been able to tease out an effect, but we have the new data up to March 2021. So I think that'll be a different type of risk. It may be more measurable than some of the other environmental risks. We thought that might be a good place to see it if it exists.
Yeah, no, 100%, because we have like Linwood Ridge as well, right, in Calgary, where you could study the people that had to move because of the contamination underneath their community or whatever, right? So that would be interesting to see. And then, yeah, go ahead.
Can I write that down? Linwood?
Yeah, Linwood Ridge in Calgary.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, no, I think it's there's so many factors in this. We recently, the reason I asked about ecosystem services earlier is because I'm not sure if you're aware, but Okotoks recently last year was we conducted an inventory of our natural assets and evaluation of our natural assets, which is the first of its kind. We don't know anybody who else had done that. Lots of people have done an inventory, but we attempted to assign value for the ecosystem services provided by those places. So we counted recreation and we counted carbon sequestration and we counted all of those things. So I'd be willing to, if you want to take a look at that as well to see what our recreation numbers look like, and if anybody's interested in that as well.
I think that there is some comparison we can do with the sort of the before and after value of the finite growth policy. I think that which is sort of an overall, it's part of the story, just the private part that can be capitalized in house prices, but it is an aggregate in a way. So it's something that would be interesting to do a comparison. It suggests that the natural assets and the pledge to protect them in Okotoks was a pretty attractive part of Okotoks, right?
And it looks like that from your data as well, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So, and I think that's why we have the population we have. We have about a 50% of avid people who are always interested in all of our strategies and our environmental initiatives and that kind of stuff. And then we have, the regular suburb folk who moved out to Okotoks because they didn't want to be big city and they wanted to have their big trucks and are not there for the nature perspective. So it's an interesting mix of people.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry, I won't monopolize your time, but I did find it all three presentations today very interesting from different perspectives, and this one obviously hit pretty close to home. So thanks for that.
Brent, I had a question about your maps, which I found fascinating. One question I had was about the difference between access to open space and proximity to open space. Obviously, it makes a difference, the configuration of the open space, if it's a network that's very well connected as opposed to subdivision built around a park or a golf course. Is that true?
So this is what we're trying to get at here with that inset in the map. When we first did this study, we just looked at the distance to one of these land types. And you can see, so we would have, how far is the person from the South Campus? That's kind of, will always be, a fairly good measure of access to the South Campus. So we would think that the closer they are to that light green area, which is the South Campus, the more they'd be willing to pay if they value that type of green space. Other types of open space are much smaller. So you can see that our data has resolution. We can get at things like pocket parks. So things which are even smaller than 30 meter resolution, which just would barely show up on a satellite image. So because we have all of the data in all of the parks for the city. So we think that is important, but there's this fact of what type of open space. So we can get at these types, and this is what we've done so far. So you can see that upper dot in the middle of that circle. We do a concentric ring of what the literature considers walking distance, about 700 meters. So a ring of about 700 meters from the house. What's the percentage of that area that's green space? And so if that was a golf course relative to a park, we wouldn't distinguish those two. But we do distinguish, we have a way of getting at kind of the intensity of the open space, which is near someone. So we feel this is a considerable improvement over the way that, we and others have handled this type of data, though Hotaka is going to get his master's student, his thesis for, even more clever ways of getting at this. So one of the challenge, just in terms of a sort of research challenge, was we wanted to make sure that everything was mutually exclusive. So we didn't have kind of double counting, which was easy to do empirically. It was easier to do double counting than to avoid double counting. So that has been in this type of work, you can give misleading answers pretty carefully if you're not careful. So we take quite a bit of care in trying to get these data into it's something which is both that we can actually do, that we have the data for, and that we can actually understand the results, and results make sense. Could I do a poll on the listeners? I wonder, what do people think we will find about the value of open space due to COVID? What's going to be important? Sherry raised the dog issue that I hadn't thought of. So what do people think we should watch for that might be important in our analysis?
This is an open poll, or multiple choice?
This is anyone who would like to share an opinion. So Marina says we would need to think about the activity levels of people. So I guess we all have our activity level, and we have the activity level we aspire to. So those two things are different for me. So I think that there's a whole set of interesting social science research that should go on around this topic, in addition to the kind of quantitative work that we can do. And I think that there are some colleagues of Sandeep's that have started to do some of this work, because we also have this, at the same time as COVID was coming out, people were paid more attention to their health, and the findings about the health benefits of living near open space were also coming out. So there is a health kind of environment interaction.
Have one more comment in the chat window. Portion who switched to remote work, possibly linked to wealth income as well. Kevin, did you want to elaborate?
Sure. I just thought that those who value and use open space more would possibly be affected by COVID. if they were working from home now, they might be able to better access those green spaces and those open areas, and therefore might place more value in them. Whereas someone who continued to work in the traditional workspace may not change their opinion about the value of green space or open space.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Kevin, and I think it also raises one more kind of green equity, aspect to this, right? Is that people who have the luxury of being able to continue with their work from home offices are probably already disproportionately benefiting from their own access to open space and to the public benefits that the city is providing through preservation and maintenance of open space, and that gets further, that privilege kind of gets further amplified a bit because of that effect. So it's something I think for us to all keep in mind.
Kathleen?
I think it'll be like all disasters. The further away we get from COVID, and if there is an eventual end, I think we will go back to our old habits. We've seen that with travel and disasters like terrorist attacks and that kind of thing. I feel like we are reticent to change behaviors as a society. So I think we will go back to our old habits.
So I anecdotally, I was shocked this winter on the White Mud Creek trails when I would be on a Saturday afternoon with hundreds of people out on the trails. And my normal trail where I meet 7 people, there would be 150 to 200 people out on the same trail. And I don't think that 150 or 200 people were out like yesterday on the trail again. They were all at the soccer game. But Hotaka has described that as reversion to the mean, right? So if we move away from our average behavior for some time, the tendency will be to revert, right? That's I think you're right. And I guess the question is, do we find lingering effects more that will be maybe one of the findings of Hotaka's work is, do the effects linger longer, or at least up until March? We just have to date up until March. Do the effect linger all the way up to March in Vancouver and less and a shorter duration in Edmonton? We'll see.
Brent, I'll read Dave's comment in the chat, or his response. The flood of people into the Kananaskis in the past 2 years tells me that people value the outdoors much more than previously. And I'll add also, I remember last year that Parks Canada announced that they were quite long lineups to get into Elk Island in the weekends.
Yeah, good. I'm just going to pose another question if I can pick people's brains, if people don't mind me asking questions. My other question is, why do you think we found that people will pay less to live near agricultural land? They're not, what might be there? So we found, just to sum, we found that people who live furthest from agricultural land were more willing to pay for general protection of land within the area around the city. But we found the closer they were to the edge of the city, which means they're close to the agricultural land, the less likely they were to be willing to pay in to protect agricultural land. And another thing we found was, in terms of the house prices, the closer to the ag land, the lower the house prices. So we think that of that as sort of a NIMBY effect, not in my backyard. We like agriculture around the area. We like the possibility of Riverbend Gardens being a supplier of vegetables in the farmer's market. We like, this rural character that we're generally in, but that people don't perceive huge benefits from living next to a canola or wheat field. They may perceive some disadvantages. And they also may think that if I live next to a wheat field or canola field at the edge of the city, well, that wheat field or canola field might be nice if it just stayed, but I'm not excited about there being another subdivision being built in that area, which may be very likely given our track record. So I guess I wonder, is it about the land use, or is it about the developability of the land use?
Brent, can you see the chat window? We have 2 comments, one from Glynis. your presentation on ag land is timely. As I saw on social media, the historical lake that was drained for agricultural merit is now built and is now underwater. And Dave, I think people rightly see ag land as inaccessible or not useful for recreation. I think if you wanted to isolate the NIMBY effect, you would ask people about conserving agricultural land that's right next door to them. I'll bet that they would be willing to pay more to have that land conserved than land on the other side of town.
Yeah, that was a real design challenge we had, right? Was how to figure out ex post we know where people lived because of because the internet gives away a lot of information when we use it. At the time, we had to think about how could we ask a question that would be relevant for people in all 6 of the areas that we studied, and so people could relate to it well enough that they could give a truthful answer to the question. So that was having a study that just focuses in one metropolitan area, just in the kind of the interface area. That would be interesting. That would be a different study. That would be an interesting one to try. Yeah. And I think Dave's right. We don't have lovely sheep grazing with pathways and kind of old stone pathways in our landscapes here, right? We have areas which really are farmers don't give them a birth, right? So I think that is one reason why we found people are more likely to pay to conserve grazing land, because I think it feels a bit more accessible than does cropland, which is a little bit different than the message that the modern Municipality Act indicates, which is to preserve prime agricultural land, which is primarily used for canola and wheat, and not land which is lower quality, which is primarily used for grazing. So our results are sort of different than the attitudes seem to be different than what the provincial government is telling them.
I think Dave has his finger on the button there. Like if there's pasture land, then your kids can walk up and say hi to the horses and whatever else. It's more of a an interactive thing, whereas you can't go for a stroll in the canola. Like you just can't, right? And also I'm not, I put in the chat, but I'm not going to discount that they're going to apply manure how many times a year. When I drive from Calgary to Edmonton, it wafts over the QE2, and I would not want to be living next to that, right? Chicken farmers as well. There's a smell, there's an odor, and it's a nuisance some of the time. And then development, I think that would have a significant factor, because you don't want to live next to a construction site for 15 years if that's the area you're going to.
Right. Yeah. So I think you're right. I think it's both of those things: the developability and that there is a NIMBY effect, right? You'd rather the only thing that offsets some of that NIMBY effect is the experience with the University of Alberta farm, where I guess people maybe have other associations. It certainly smells when they clean the barns there, and the nearby neighbors complain to the university. I've received some of those calls myself, but I think they do perceive that it is a little bit accessible. There are walking trails within the farm, and they perceive the farm is a little bit of a buffer to the kind of the rest of the city.
Sorry, just one more comment, Erin.
Oh, absolutely.
If we're honest, farms are factories, right? They have equipment going on all the time. I think that the University of Alberta's farm would be considered more of a not-for-profit idealist kind of thing, whereas a factory farm or something producing all the time does not have the touchy-feely.
Right. Thank you. Good points.
Well, we started a few hours ago when it was nice and sunny outside, and it's almost getting dark. So we really appreciate everyone giving us your time, the presenters most of all, but everybody, thanks for spending the afternoon with us. You can see more of our work and more about this work on our website. Write to us if you require more information, or we can help communicate in any other way. And we look forward to seeing all of you in future ALI events.